My name is Brandon, and I'm part of a group of 5 friends who decided to venture on a camping trip in a remote valley. The idea was simple: escape the hustle and bustle of the city and spend a few days in contact with nature. The valley, surrounded by towering mountains and dense forests, seemed like the perfect place for that. The journey there was long, but the scenery around us was breathtaking. As soon as we arrived, the feeling of isolation hit us in a way that was both comforting and slightly unsettling. We set up camp in a clearing where the sun lit up the ground covered in dry leaves. We were all excited about spending a few days there, far from everything and everyone. The tranquility of the place was palpable, with only the sound of birds and the rustling of trees in the wind. We talked about how much we needed this break from our hectic lives, and the environment seemed to welcome us with open arms. As the afternoon wore on, we began exploring the area around the campsite. The distant mountains and dense trees created a perfect backdrop for photos and hikes. We laughed, took pictures, and enjoyed the moment. But we couldn't ignore the growing sense that we were far from any civilization. The forest around us was dense, almost suffocating, and it seemed to hide secrets that we, innocently, were not ready to uncover. As night fell, we lit a campfire and gathered around it, sharing stories and laughs. The warmth of the fire contrasted with the cold that began to set in, and the flickering flames cast dancing shadows around us. We were comfortable, with no apparent worries, but somewhere inside me, I felt that the calm of that night was about to be shattered. Little did we know that the night would make us question our decision to camp in that valley. Finally, we prepared to sleep, curling up in our sleeping bags inside the tents. The darkness around us was complete, broken only by the distant sounds of the forest's nightlife. I closed my eyes, trying to let the day's fatigue take over, but a slight unease kept me awake. Perhaps it was just adjusting to the new environment, or maybe something deeper, something we hadn't yet noticed. And so, with that feeling, I fell asleep, unaware that the night would bring something much more disturbing. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound, something I couldn't immediately identify. I sat up in my sleeping bag, rubbing my eyes, trying to get my bearings. That's when I realized it was the distant sound of drums. The rhythm was steady, a low, deep beat that seemed to come from within the forest. My first reaction was to think I was imagining things, but when I looked around, I saw that the others were awake too, all with expressions of confusion and concern. We stepped out of the tents, still groggy but now fully alert. The drums continued, resonating through the night, and the sound seemed to fill the entire valley. The forest, which had once seemed so welcoming, now felt like it was hiding something much more sinister. We stood there for a few minutes, trying to understand what was happening. Who would be playing drums in the middle of such a remote forest, and why? These questions began forming in our minds, but no one had answers. 2 of my friends, Tom and Lisa, suggested we investigate. They were curious to discover the source of the drums, perhaps hoping to find some logical explanation. However, the rest of the group, including myself, was reluctant. There was something about the sound of those drums that made us uncomfortable, as if we were hearing something we weren't supposed to. The idea of venturing into the forest in the middle of the night to follow that sound seemed dangerously reckless. As we debated what to do, the drums began to intensify. The sound, which had previously seemed distant, was now closer, louder, and with it, a growing feeling that something was wrong. The forest, which had once been a place of adventure, now felt like a place of hidden dangers. The atmosphere around us became heavy, and fear began to spread among us, silently but inexorably. We decided not to stray from the campsite. The curiosity to explore the source of the drums was quickly suppressed by the instinct for self-preservation. We returned to our tents, trying to ignore the sound that still echoed through the forest. But as the drums continued to play, sleep became impossible. We stayed awake, waiting for the sound to stop, but with the feeling that something very strange was about to happen. The next morning, the sound of the drums was still fresh in our minds. We tried to act normally, but the strangeness of what we had heard the night before was clear in everyone's eyes. Tom and Lisa were still curious, determined to find out what was behind that mysterious sound. They suggested we go into the forest during the day, when everything seemed less threatening, to see if we could find any clues. The rest of the group, however, wasn't as enthusiastic. The fear and uncertainty of the previous night still held us back, and the idea of following the sound of the drums, even during the day, seemed risky. I was one of those who didn't want to go. There was something deeply wrong with the situation, and my gut told me not to push our luck. However, Tom and Lisa's curiosity was palpable, and they were determined to explore further. In the end, we decided that half the group would stay at the campsite, while Tom and Lisa did a little exploration at the edge of the forest. They promised not to go far, just enough to see if they could find something that explained the sound of the drums. I stayed at the camp with Mike and Sarah, trying to shake the feeling that this was a bad idea. As Tom and Lisa walked away, the silence around us seemed to deepen, as if the forest was waiting for something. Time passed slowly as we waited. The forest was quiet, without the sound of drums, but the feeling of unease persisted. We spoke little, each lost in our own thoughts, but what we all shared was the sense that something was deeply wrong. Finally, Tom and Lisa returned, saying they hadn't found anything special, just the dense, silent forest. They tried to appear disappointed, but the tension on their faces was clear. As the day wore on, we tried to move on and enjoy the camp, but the shadow of the drums seemed to hang over us. No one could fully relax, and the light-hearted and carefree atmosphere of the first day was irretrievably lost. We knew something had changed, and no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't ignore the feeling that we were being watched, that the forest was hiding secrets we shouldn't have disturbed. That night, we decided not to stray from the camp. The sound of the drums was still fresh in our memories, and no one wanted to repeat the experience. We gathered around the campfire, trying to recapture the spirit of camaraderie that had brought us there. But the silence of the forest was unsettling, as if the very environment was waiting to reveal something. With every crackle of the flames, with every sigh of the wind, we looked at each other nervously, expecting something to happen. Time passed slowly, and the conversation became sparse. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone was nervous. The forest, which had once seemed full of life, was now completely silent. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling leaves. It was as if nature itself had decided to hold its breath. The silence was oppressive, as if the forest was preparing the stage for something dark and unknown. That's when the sound of the drums started again. But this time, it was different. Instead of coming from afar, it seemed much closer, as if the trees around us were echoing the sound. We all exchanged glances, fear clearly etched on our faces. The rhythm was slow, deliberate, and with each beat, the panic inside me grew. I tried to convince myself it was just the echo of some ancient tribe, but the sound seemed directed at us, like a warning or a threat. Suddenly the drums stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was as if the sound had been abruptly cut off, leaving us in the vacuum of absolute silence. We looked around, trying to find any sign of movement, but there was nothing. Just the darkness of the forest and the growing sensation that something was watching us, hidden in the shadows between the trees. The air seemed heavier, as if we were breathing in fear itself. That night was long and unbearable. We stayed together around the fire, too afraid to move away, each of us battling the panic that threatened to take over. The hours dragged on, but the silence remained, relentless and oppressive. No one slept. We knew something was wrong, and the absence of any sound, apart from our tense breathing, was an omen that something more was coming. When morning finally came, we all knew the camp would never be the same. The relief we felt at seeing the morning light was brief. We tried to convince ourselves that the sound of the drums was just an anomaly, something unimportant, but the silence that followed had left a mark on all of us. We decided to continue camping, trying to push away the feeling of fear. Mike, wanting to return to normalcy, offered to go get more firewood from the nearby forest. We agreed despite a slight hesitation, and he set off alone, assuring us he'd be back soon. Time passed, and Mike didn't return. At first we weren't worried. Maybe he had found a good spot with firewood and was taking longer than expected to gather it. But as the hours dragged on, we began to feel uneasy. We called out for Mike several times, but there was no response. Panic slowly began to set in as we imagined what could have happened. Mike's disappearance turned what was supposed to be a peaceful morning into a growing nightmare. We decided to split up to look for him. The forest, which during the day had seemed safer, now turned into a maze of uncertainties. As we ventured deeper among the trees, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. The silence was disturbing, and the idea that Mike might be in danger became more and more real. We called out for him, but the only response we received was the echo of our own voices, lost in the vastness of the forest. The search for Mike became more desperate with each passing minute. We began to stray further from the camp, ignoring the idea that it might be safer to stay together. The fear for our friend drove us forward, but the forest seemed to conspire against us, hiding clues, muffling sounds. The environment around us, which had once been so welcoming, now felt like a trap, and every step we took led us further from safety. Finally, we regrouped, all unsuccessful in finding any sign of Mike. The panic was evident on our faces. We didn't know what to do, and the desperation of losing a friend in such a remote forest left us feeling helpless. The idea that something had happened to him, something terrible, was inevitable. We decided to continue the search, but the fear that we too might be in danger began to creep into our minds. As we continued to look for Mike, we came across something that deeply disturbed us. On the trunk of an old tree, we found symbols carved into the wood with frightening precision. The symbols were strange, forming patterns that none of us recognized. There was something deeply unsettling about them, as if they belonged to some ancient cult or ritualistic practice. The sight of those symbols only heightened the feeling that we were in forbidden territory. We followed the tracks we found near the symbols, hoping they would lead us to Mike. The tracks seemed fresh, but what accompanied them made us even more uneasy. On every tree we passed, more symbols appeared, like a warning that we were delving into something we shouldn't. The forest around us grew denser, the trees closer together, and the sunlight barely penetrated the canopy above us. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the feeling that we were being watched grew stronger with every step. Every movement in the shadows, every snap of a branch, made our hearts race. We couldn't see who or what was watching us, but the presence was almost tangible. The idea that Mike had been taken by something that lived in that forest began to take root in our minds. The fear of finding more than just symbols made us hesitate, but continuing the search was our only option. As we moved forward, the dread that something was closing in on us intensified. The symbols, which had once been isolated, now appeared on almost every tree, as if we were following a path marked by someone or something. The forest, which had once been just a part of nature, now seemed to have a life of its own, full of secrets and dangers that we were only beginning to understand. With each step, the sense that we were getting closer to something terrible grew stronger. Finally, we reached a clearing where the symbols were even more abundant, covering the surrounding trees like a macabre tapestry. The clearing was enveloped in absolute silence, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. We knew we were close to something. But what? Panic began to take hold of us, and the clearing, which should have been a place of rest, became a scene of terror. We decided it was time to go back, but then, something we hadn't expected happened. As we prepared to leave the clearing, the sensation that something was watching us became overwhelming. We began to hear noises around us, branches snapping, light footsteps that seemed to move with eerie precision. We looked in all directions, trying to identify the source of the sounds, but the forest seemed alive, hiding whatever was there. The clearing, which had been silent moments before, was now filled with an invisible presence that surrounded us. The tension was palpable. Each of us held our breath, trying not to make any noise as our eyes scanned the shadows between the trees. The fear that something might emerge at any moment kept us frozen, but we knew we couldn't stay there. We needed to leave that clearing, get back to the camp, and if possible, leave that valley as quickly as we could. But every step we took seemed to bring us closer to danger. Then we saw the masked figures emerge from the darkness. They stepped out of the shadows, moving with unsettling synchronization, slowly surrounding us. They held torches, and the glow of the flames revealed details of the masks, which were grotesque and terrifying, as if they had been carved to evoke fear. Panic seized us, and we knew we were in great danger. The figures didn't speak, only moved in silence, like a collective entity guided by a purpose we couldn't comprehend. As we were surrounded, one of the figures stood out from the others, moving with more determination. As it approached, we realized it was carrying something, or someone. It was Mike, unconscious and gagged, his body limp. The horror we felt at seeing our friend in that state was overwhelming. The masked figure came closer, until it was just a few feet away from us. With a sudden movement, it dropped Mike to the ground, as if he were a dead weight, and then stepped back. Without saying a word, the masked figures disappeared into the darkness of the forest, leaving us paralyzed and in shock. We rushed to Mike, who was beginning to regain consciousness, but was clearly disoriented and unable to remember what had happened. The only thing that mattered at that moment was getting him out of there, as quickly as possible. We lifted Mike, supporting him as best we could, and began to flee from that clearing, leaving behind the terror and the secrets the valley held. The escape through the valley was frantic. With Mike supported between us, we ran as fast as we could, not looking back. The fear that the masked figures might be following us pushed us to keep going, despite the exhaustion and panic that gripped us. Every step felt heavier, and the forest around us seemed to want to swallow us, but the thought of escaping that horrible place gave us the strength to continue. No one spoke. The silence was filled only by the hurried sounds of our feet against the ground and our labored breathing. We reached the campsite, but we didn't waste time. We grabbed our things in a rush, throwing everything haphazardly into our backpacks. There was no time to think or organize, only to flee. The sun was beginning to set, and the idea of spending another night in that valley was unbearable. With Mike still weak and unable to walk on his own, we took turns carrying him. The only thing that mattered was getting out of there before darkness fell again and brought back the horrors we had just witnessed. As we walked back along the trail that would lead us out of the valley, Mike began to regain consciousness. We tried to talk to him, asking what had happened, but he couldn't remember anything. All he said was that he had gone to get firewood, and after that, everything was a blur. The frustration of not having answers mixed with the relief of finally leaving that place behind. But the unanswered questions continued to haunt us. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we reached the road where we had left the cars. We threw the backpacks into the trunk and helped Mike into the vehicle. The relief of being out of the valley was immediate, but the fear lingered, like a shadow that couldn't be dispelled by mere distance. We quickly drove away, heading far from that cursed place, without looking back. But even as the valley disappeared in the rearview mirror, we knew the memories of what we had experienced there wouldn't leave us so easily. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, processing what had happened. The masked figures, the drums, the strange symbols, all of it formed a puzzle we might never be able to solve. Mike, though safe, was marked by an emptiness we couldn't fill. And so, as we moved further and further away from that valley, one thing was certain. We would never return to that place where the secrets of the forest would remain hidden, waiting for others who, by chance or curiosity, dared to disturb what should never be disturbed. My name is Daniel, and I've always sought personal challenges that would allow me to escape the routine. When I decided to camp alone on a little-known trail in the mountains, the idea was simple. Spend a few days in nature, far from everything and everyone. I wanted to disconnect, find peace, and perhaps even rediscover myself. The trail I chose was isolated, mentioned only in a few mountaineering guides, which made it even more appealing. I thought I was prepared for anything, or so I believed. I arrived at the base of the mountain in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The trail was narrow and surrounded by dense vegetation, but I didn't mind. I set up my tent beside a stream, where the water flowed gently, reflecting the last light of the day. The sound of the water was relaxing, a reminder that I was in a place where time seemed to slow down. I planned to explore the trail to the top of the mountain the next day, hoping to find breathtaking views and a sense of accomplishment. As I organized my things and prepared a simple dinner, I felt satisfied with my choice. The solitude didn't bother me. In fact, it was something I sought out. The silence of the forest was comforting, interrupted only by the sounds of birds and the stream. I was exactly where I wanted to be, far from everyday worries, immersed in nature. After dinner, I sat by the stream, watching the sky slowly fill with stars. The tranquility of the place enveloped me, and I allowed myself to relax completely. As night approached, I decided to retreat to the tent. The fatigue from the journey began to weigh on me, and I lay down in my sleeping bag, listening to the calming sound of the flowing water. The forest around me was shrouded in darkness, but I wasn't afraid. I was there to face the unknown and challenge myself, and the feeling of being alone in such a remote place was almost liberating. I closed my eyes, letting the fatigue take over, unaware that the tranquility wouldn't last long. Before falling asleep, I thought about how the next day would be both challenging and rewarding. I was ready to face the mountain, ready to discover what it had to offer. Little did I know that something would happen that night, something that would completely change my perception of the forest's tranquility. And so, I fell asleep, eager for what was to come, but without any suspicion of what really awaited me. Sleep came quickly, but it wasn't deep. In the middle of the night, I was suddenly awakened by a strange sound, something that didn't belong to the natural sounds of the forest. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but the sounds continued, repeating at irregular intervals. They were heavy footsteps, as if someone or something was circling around my campsite. My heart began to beat faster as I lay there, trying to identify what could be causing the noise. I stayed still for a few minutes, listening intently. The sound of the footsteps was unmistakable, and the feeling that there was something or someone there with me was disturbing. I decided I needed to check what was happening, even though fear began to creep into my thoughts. I grabbed my flashlight, and with some hesitation unzipped the tent. The night was dark, and the forest seemed like a vast sea of shadows where anything could be hiding. I stepped out of the tent, illuminating the surroundings with the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything unusual. I walked around the campsite, looking for any sign of movement or tracks, but found nothing. The feeling of being watched was intense, but there was no one there, at least not that I could see. I stood still for a few moments, trying to hear the footsteps again, but all I heard was the sound of the running water and the rustling of leaves. After a quick and fruitless search, I returned to the tent. The fear was still there, but I tried to convince myself that it had just been a wild animal passing by. I zipped up the tent, lay down again, and forced myself to relax. Even so, I couldn't fall asleep immediately. I lay there, listening intently for any sound, trying to ignore the discomfort that now surrounded me. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell asleep, still worried about what might be out there. The next morning, when I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky, and the forest seemed as peaceful as before. The events of the previous night felt distant, almost unreal, but the memory of the heavy footsteps still echoed in my mind. I decided to continue with my plans, even though that strange feeling lingered. It was just the beginning of something I didn't yet understand, something that would completely change the course of this adventure. After a peaceful morning, during which I tried to push away the disturbing thoughts from the night before, I began to prepare to explore the trail to the top of the mountain. While dismantling the campsite, something strange caught my attention. Near the stream, where I had fetched water the day before, there was a formation of stones that hadn't been there before. The stones were stacked in an organized manner, forming an arrow that pointed into the forest, in a direction that wasn't the main trail. I stood there for a moment, observing the arrow, trying to figure out who could have made it. I was camping alone, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone else in the area. The arrow seemed like an invitation or perhaps a warning, but I couldn't discern which. My curiosity was immediately piqued, mixed with a growing sense of unease. It was as if someone or something was trying to guide me to a specific place. But why? And for what purpose? I decided to investigate. I grabbed my backpack, packed only the essentials, and prepared to follow the direction indicated by the arrow. The idea of discovering a new path, perhaps a hidden secret in the forest, was too tempting to ignore. Besides, I was there in search of challenges, and this seemed to be exactly what I wanted. The stone arrow pointed to a part of the forest I hadn't yet explored, a dense and seemingly untouched area. As I followed the direction indicated, the vegetation around me became increasingly thick. The main trail was left behind, and I moved further and further away from what I had initially planned. The feeling of doing something forbidden was palpable, but at the same time exciting. Each step I took led me deeper into the forest, and the idea that I was exploring a path that few, if any, had ever walked gave me an extra push. After walking for some time, I finally found what appeared to be a narrow path, almost hidden among the trees. It wasn't marked on the map I had brought, and the trail was so rarely used that it was almost imperceptible. My curiosity was now at its peak, and I decided to continue. Each step took me further away from the main trail, and the feeling that I was entering unknown territory only grew. Little did I know that this decision would trigger a series of events I could never have predicted. This trail I found was unlike any other I had ever hiked. The path was difficult to follow, with thick roots and dense vegetation blocking my way. I advanced slowly, needing to duck under low branches and push aside leaves to clear a path. Every step required effort, but the feeling of discovering something new and unexplored kept me moving. As I progressed, the forest around me seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, as if they were trying to stop me from moving forward. The sunlight, which had been bright and comforting before, now barely penetrated the canopy, leaving the environment dark and oppressive. I began to feel that I was being watched, as if something or someone was closely following me, hidden in the shadows. Every time I stopped to listen, the silence was absolute, but the feeling of being followed didn't go away. The path didn't appear on the map I carried, which only increased my curiosity. Who had created this trail? And why? These questions echoed in my mind as I walked, trying to push away the growing fear. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, and the realization that I was moving further and further away from the safety of the main trail worried me. Even so, I kept moving forward, driven by curiosity and the sense that I was about to discover something important. As time passed, I began to hear noises that made me even more uneasy. They were footsteps, distant but unmistakable, that seemed to follow the rhythm of my own. Whenever I stopped, the footsteps stopped too, leaving a heavy silence in the air. The idea that I was being followed or watched became almost unbearable. I looked back several times, expecting to see something, but the trail remained empty except for me. Fear began to mix with adrenaline, turning each step into a challenge. Despite the growing fear, I couldn't stop. Something about that path called to me, compelled me to continue, as if there was an answer waiting for me at the end. I knew I was straying from the safe path, but the idea of turning back seemed impossible. I had to find out what was at the end of that trail. With my heart pounding in my chest and my mind full of doubts, I continued moving forward, hoping that the answers were just ahead, hidden in the darkness of the forest. The air grew heavier, laden with moisture and a stronger smell of wet earth with each step. The feeling of being followed never left me, and I began to grow paranoid, looking back every few minutes. But every time I stopped, everything went silent, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Fear and adrenaline were in constant battle within me. Part of me wanted to turn back, run back to the main trail and forget about this hidden path. But another part, a more curious and stubborn part, pushed me forward. After all, I was here in search of challenges, and this unknown trail seemed like the greatest challenge of all. With each step, I felt I was closer to discovering something important, something that could change everything I knew about this forest. Then I saw something that made my heart nearly stop. Ahead, amidst the dense vegetation, there was a structure. It was a small cabin hidden among the trees, almost swallowed by the forest around it. The sight of the cabin left me torn between relief at finally finding something tangible and terror at not knowing what awaited me inside. Who had built that cabin? And why was it there, in such a remote and isolated place? The questions multiplied in my mind as I cautiously approached. As I got closer, I realized the cabin was in poor condition, as if no one had lived in it for a long time. However, There were signs that someone had been there recently. The door was slightly ajar, and there were footprints in the dirt, indicating movement around the structure. A chill ran down my spine. Despite all the evidence of abandonment, something about the cabin felt alive, as if it was waiting for me. I knew I should turn back, but my curiosity led me to take a few more steps toward the door. I took a deep breath, trying to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. Carefully, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The atmosphere inside the cabin was suffocating. The interior was dark and stuffy, with a strong smell of mold and rotting wood. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened there. There was a table with a chair knocked over, as if someone had stood up abruptly. Yellowed papers were scattered on the floor, along with some objects that seemed to have been left behind. Everything indicated that someone had lived there, but why had they left so suddenly? The question echoed in my mind as I explored the small space. On the table there was an old, dusty journal. I picked it up carefully, feeling the rough texture of the worn leather. I opened the journal and flipped through a few pages, but the writing was almost illegible, with words hastily scribbled. I couldn't make out much of what was written, but a few words and phrases stood out. Danger, don't follow, they're here. Reading it gave me chills. Whoever had written those words was desperate to leave a warning that I might have taken seriously. As I examined the journal, something caught my attention. There was a message carved into the wood of the door, something I hadn't noticed before. I moved closer and read the words etched into the wood. You should have stayed on the trail. Fear gripped me in a way I had never experienced before. That message was clear, a warning that I had made a mistake by straying from the main path. I felt panic start to rise within me, a sense that I needed to leave immediately. Without a second thought, I decided it was time to go. I turned quickly, ready to leave the cabin and head back the way I had come. But as I took the first step toward the door, I heard a sound that froze me in place. It was a low whisper, almost inaudible, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. My heart raced, and I felt fear completely take over. The whisper came again, and I knew at that moment that I wasn't alone. Something or someone was in there with me, and I didn't want to find out what it was. In a panic, I ran out of the cabin, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what might be following me. All I could think about was getting back to the main trail, back to safety. But as I ran, the sound of footsteps behind me became clearer, as if something was chasing me. The fear I felt was overwhelming, and every second felt like an eternity as I fought to escape that cabin and whatever was hiding in the forest. As soon as I left the cabin, panic consumed me. The fresh air of the forest should have calmed me, but instead, it seemed to carry a heavy charge of fear, as if nature itself was conspiring against me. I started walking quickly back down the narrow path, but the feeling that something was wrong only intensified. The trees seemed to close in around me, as if trying to block my way, and the sounds of the forest, which had once been comforting, now seemed sinister, filled with hidden intentions. The message on the door, "You should have stayed on the trail," kept running through my mind. Every step I took felt like a challenge to that warning, as if I was tempting fate by trying to leave. As I quickened my pace, a cold breeze passed by me, bringing with it a barely perceptible whisper. Stopping for a moment, I heard the clear sound of footsteps behind me. My blood ran cold. I quickly turned, shining the light from my flashlight, but there was nothing there. The emptiness was oppressive, as if the very air was watching me. With my heart pounding, I began to run, panic taking hold of every fiber of my being. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, each step taking me further from the safety I so desperately sought. That's when I heard the whisper again, now closer, almost beside me. The sound was distinct, like incomplete words coming from all directions. I felt the presence of something I couldn't see, but that was there, surrounding me, watching me. There was no time to think. The only thing I knew was that I had to run. As I ran, the whispers turned into low, disturbing laughter, echoing around me. Terror drove me forward, and I felt that at any moment, something would emerge from the shadows to grab me. My legs ached, and the air seemed thicker, making it harder to breathe. Then I tripped, falling heavily to the ground. The impact left me dazed, but there was no time to feel pain. I quickly got up, my senses on high alert, but what I saw made me freeze in fear. In front of me, on the trail, there was a figure. It was indistinct, a humanoid shadow that seemed to float above the ground. Its eyes, if it had eyes, were 2 points of darkness even deeper than the night itself. I stood frozen, unable to move as the figure slowly approached, as if savoring my fear. The laughter around me grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest was enjoying my terror. There was no escape. I was trapped. With a desperate scream, I finally managed to move, turning and running in the opposite direction, toward anywhere that could save me from this living nightmare. I ran like I had never run before, terror driving me to a speed I didn't know I could reach. The sound of my footsteps was muffled by the disturbing laughter that seemed to come from all sides, an insane cacophony that made my heart feel like it was about to explode. There was no more reasoning, only the instinct to survive. The shadows around me seemed to take shape, moving with malicious intent, as if trying to grab me. The path ahead of me distorted, and I no longer knew if I was running away or in circles. The cabin felt far behind now, but the sense that something was following me didn't diminish. On the contrary, I could feel the presence getting closer. Closer, as if it was playing with me, prolonging my agony. My legs burned and exhaustion threatened to bring me down, but I couldn't stop. The fear of being caught by that thing was greater than any physical pain. The air around me seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, and the insane laughter didn't cease, echoing in my mind like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw my campsite. The sight should have brought relief, but the panic was so great that I could barely process what I was seeing. When I reached the campsite, I stumbled again, falling to my knees. Exhaustion almost overcame me, but fear wouldn't let me stop. In a frenzy, I began to pack my things, throwing them into my backpack haphazardly. I needed to get out of there, and fast. I felt like every second that passed brought me closer to the end. As soon as I finished, I ran toward my car, barely able to keep my balance as my thoughts disintegrated into pure panic. When I reached the vehicle, the keys slipped from my trembling hands, falling to the ground. The sense of despair almost overwhelmed me, but I managed to pick them up and get into the car. I locked the doors and started the engine, the sound of the engine roaring into the silent night. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for my next move. Before accelerating, I instinctively looked into the rearview mirror. Horror took hold of me as I saw the dark figure standing behind the car, motionless but clearly watching. Its face, if it had one, was a mask of shadows, and its presence was suffocating. With a scream of pure terror, I sped away from the campsite, the car's tires skidding on the ground as I fled from that nightmare. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought I might pass out, but I kept driving, not looking back, with the sole aim of escaping. As the road unfolded before me, fear slowly began to turn into a feeling of emptiness, a black hole that consumed all my energy. I was safe, but at the same time, I knew I hadn't really escaped. What I had experienced in that forest was etched into my mind, a scar I would carry forever. The words on the cabin door echoed in my head, "You should have stayed on the trail." Now those words sounded like a curse, a warning I had ignored and was now paying the price for. Finally, I saw the lights of a city in the distance, but the relief I expected to feel didn't come. Instead, a sense of loss overwhelmed me, as if something inside me had been stolen by that forest. When I stopped the car at a small motel, I was completely exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I entered the room and locked the door, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I lay down on the bed, but sleep didn't come. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the sound of laughter still echoed in my ears. I knew I would never be the same again. That night had changed something fundamental within me. And as I closed my eyes, one question kept hammering in my mind. What had really followed me in that forest? And had it really ended, or had it just begun? My name is Laura, and that week I decided to disconnect from the world and spend a few days alone in an ancient forest, seeking some peace and tranquility. I chose a place that seemed perfect, the base of a large cliff where I could set up my camp and enjoy the natural beauty around me. The journey there was long but rewarding. When I arrived, the place seemed isolated, calm, and exactly what I needed. I set up my tent, organized my things, and prepared for a peaceful night surrounded by nature. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind created a natural symphony that calmed my mind. I was excited to spend the next few days exploring the area, hiking, and reconnecting with myself. The view from the cliff was stunning, and the fresh forest air revitalized me. Everything seemed perfect, and I was happy with my choice of location. However, as the sun began to set, the feeling of isolation started to creep in, reminding me that I was completely alone in an unknown place. As day turned to night, I lit a small campfire and sat down to enjoy the silence around me. Darkness began to envelop the forest, and the sounds of nocturnal animals replaced the birdsong. The full moon slowly rose behind the trees, casting long, mysterious shadows on the ground. Although I was comfortable, a slight unease began to grow inside me, as if something in the forest was waiting to reveal itself. I tried to shake off this feeling, telling myself it was just the effect of solitude. Later, I retreated to the tent, zipped it up, and curled up in the sleeping bag. The day's fatigue helped me relax, and I soon began to drift off. The night was cold, but my tent kept me well protected, and the soft sound of the wind through the trees felt like a constant, almost soothing whisper. Before I fully fell asleep, I thought about how grateful I was for this peaceful moment, far from the worries of daily life. Little did I know that this sense of tranquility was about to be shattered by something I could never have predicted. I fell asleep with a slight smile on my face, happy that I had allowed myself this experience of being alone in nature. However, deep in my mind, the unease still lingered, a small voice warning me that the night might bring unwanted surprises. But I was determined not to let fear control me. I closed my eyes and let sleep take over, confident that the next day would be full of new discoveries and adventures. However, what awaited me that night was far beyond what I could have imagined. I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest, not knowing what had startled me from my sleep. For a moment, I lay still, trying to figure out what was wrong. Then I heard it again, a distant, anguished scream, so clear that it made me sit up in a rush. The sound cut through the tranquility of the night, full of despair, as if someone was in great danger. Fear instantly gripped me, but at the same time, I felt an urgent need to find out where the sound was coming from. I stepped out of the tent, still groggy, and was greeted by the cold night air. I looked around, trying to see something in the darkness, but everything was shrouded in shadows. The scream repeated, coming from somewhere beyond the tree line toward the cliff. The sound was disturbing, but it also seemed so desperate that I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed my flashlight and, with trembling hands, turned it on. The weak light barely penetrated the darkness, but it was better than nothing. As I took my first steps toward the sound, part of me hesitated. I was alone, in the middle of a forest, and I knew it could be dangerous to go out and investigate something so mysterious. But the thought that someone might be in need of help was too strong to ignore. Each step I took seemed to echo in the night, and the silence around me made everything even more frightening. The forest, which had once seemed welcoming, now felt full of hidden dangers. The scream kept repeating, getting more distant each time, but still clear enough to guide me. With the flashlight in hand, I began walking toward the sound, feeling the cold ground through my boots. The vegetation was dense, and I had to push my way through branches and bushes. Every leaf I touched seemed to have a life of its own, and the wind blowing through the trees produced eerie whispers. I tried to focus, concentrating only on the sound of the scream, but the fear inside me grew with each step. Despite the fear, I kept following the sound, determined to find the source of the scream. The darkness around me seemed to come alive, and the flashlight, which had previously given me comfort, now seemed insufficient. With every step, I wondered if I was doing the right thing, but the thought of returning to the tent without knowing what was happening seemed even worse. So, with my heart racing and breathing heavily, I continued moving forward into the darkness, not knowing what I would find. The sound of the scream continued to guide me as I delved deeper into the forest. The flashlight illuminated only a small area in front of me, leaving the rest of the path shrouded in darkness. The vegetation grew denser, with branches seeming to reach out to grab me, while damp leaves brushed against my face and arms. The terrain was uneven, and I had to be careful not to trip over rocks or exposed roots. But despite all the obstacles, the need to find the source of that scream pushed me forward. The scream kept echoing through the forest, but every time I tried to get closer, it seemed that the source of the sound moved farther away. The feeling that I was being led somewhere began to take shape in my mind, but the idea that someone was in danger kept me from giving up. The darkness around me was oppressive, and the sound of my footsteps seemed unnervingly loud in the night silence. The forest, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a place where dangers lurked in every shadow. I continued moving forward, deeper and deeper into the forest. The flashlight illuminated broken branches and fallen leaves, but nothing that indicated the presence of another person. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, as if it was trying to trap me within. With each step, the feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to wonder if I was alone, or if something else was accompanying me on this journey. The thought of returning to the tent crossed my mind, but the now weaker scream urged me to keep going. As I moved forward, I began to feel a change in the atmosphere around me. The air felt heavier, and the temperature dropped even more. The flashlight began to flicker, occasionally cutting out as if the battery was dying. The idea of being left in the dark in the middle of that forest terrified me, but I pressed on. The scream repeated once more, now almost inaudible but still enough to guide me. The sense of urgency increased, and I knew I needed to find the person before it was too late. Despite the growing fear, I couldn't stop. The forest felt like an endless maze, each tree identical to the last, each shadow more threatening than the one before. But the scream, even faint, was a beacon guiding me. I knew I was close, but the idea that the forest was conspiring against me became increasingly real. The fear that something terrible was lurking made me tremble, but I kept going, with the flickering flashlight and my pounding heart, toward whatever awaited me in the darkness. As I pushed deeper into the forest, something changed in the environment around me. I started noticing signs that indicated a struggle had occurred there. Broken branches littered the ground, and the leaves on the trees seemed to have been torn off forcibly. My heart raced as I saw confused footprints in the mud, as if someone had been dragged or was running in desperation. The sight of these signs heightened the fear inside me, but it also intensified my determination to continue. I needed to know what had happened and if the person who had screamed was still nearby. The darkness around me grew thicker, and the flashlight, now weak, barely illuminated the path ahead. Each step I took felt more unstable, and I had to be careful not to slip. My stomach churned at the thought that I was walking into something much bigger than I had imagined, but the sight of the signs of a struggle kept me from turning back. The forest, which had once been just a backdrop, now seemed alive, watching my every move, waiting to reveal its secrets. Then I saw something that made me stop. In the middle of the path, dark stains marked the ground and the leaves around it. I knelt down for a closer look and realized they were bloodstains. Shock washed over me, and my mind began racing with all the horrible possibilities. The scream I had heard earlier echoed in my mind, and now I knew the situation was far more serious than I had imagined. Someone was hurt, or worse, and I was alone, in the middle of a forest, not knowing what to do next. The sight of the blood made me hesitate for a moment. The idea of continuing terrified me, but the possibility that someone was seriously injured or in danger was something I couldn't ignore. I tried to push the fear away, focusing on the task at hand. I gripped the flashlight more firmly and continued, though each step was now taken with a mixture of terror and determination. The forest seemed quieter than ever, as if waiting to see what I would do next. I kept moving forward, deeper into the darkness of the forest. The scream that had guided me there was now almost inaudible, but the signs of a struggle gave me a new drive to press on. The flashlight flickered, but I kept my focus on the path ahead, trying to ignore the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. I knew I was close, and the thought of finding the person who had screamed somehow gave me the strength to keep going, but at the same time, the feeling that something was terribly wrong wouldn't leave me alone. It was colder, and the wind blowing through the trees carried a strange sound, like a whisper. The scream repeated, but now it sounded weaker, as if the person was losing strength. The flashlight failed with each step, and the fear of being completely in the dark made me quicken my pace. Finally, I saw a vague figure in the distance, at the edge of the cliff. My heart raced, and I began to approach cautiously, calling out to the person. As I got closer, the figure remained still, and a sense of terror began to creep in. Something was wrong. I called out again, but there was no response. The figure seemed not to hear me, or perhaps was too weak to react. When I was just a few meters away, I stopped, watching carefully. The figure was standing at the edge of the abyss, as if about to fall, but something about it seemed off, as if it wasn't entirely real. The wind picked up, and the flashlight flickered again, casting dancing shadows around the figure. I decided to take a few more steps, reaching out to try to help, but as soon as I did, the figure vanished. It was as if it had dissolved into the air, leaving me alone at the edge of the cliff. I froze, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Fear gripped me, and the forest around me, which had once felt so full of life, was now plunged into a deadly silence. I looked around, trying to find any sign that the person was still nearby, but there was nothing. The only thing left was the void where the figure had been, and the sense that something terrible had happened there. The sound of the wind was the only thing I could hear, and the weight of the silence around me was unbearable. I knew I needed to get out of there, to return to camp, but my body was frozen with fear. Finally, I managed to move and started to make my way back down, my heart still racing and my mind full of unanswered questions. As I tried to process what had just happened, a sense of unreality took over me. What had I seen? Or was it all just a trick of my mind? I was alone in the forest, surrounded by darkness, and all I could think about was the figure that had disappeared before my eyes. I tried to rationalize, telling myself that maybe I was tired, that the darkness had played a trick on me. But deep down, I knew there was something very wrong happening there. I began descending from the cliff, trying to find my way back to camp. Each step felt harder than the last, as if the fear was seeping into my muscles, making them heavy. The scream that had once guided me was now gone, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of the wind and the rustling of leaves around me. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and I knew I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I walked, I looked down and saw my camp in the distance, small and insignificant at the base of the cliff. The relief of seeing everything in place gave me a brief sense of safety, but it didn't last long. As I began to descend the path back, I heard the scream again, this time much closer, as if it was right behind me. Panic took hold of me, and I quickly turned, shining the flashlight into the forest. But there was no one there. The silence that followed was deafening, and the feeling that something was about to catch up with me made me start running. I ran as fast as I could, descending the cliff, dodging rocks and roots, trying not to think about what might be following me. The scream repeated again, now weaker but still present, and each time I heard it, I felt as if I was being pulled back into the darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me, as if trying to keep me there, but the sight of the camp in the distance gave me the strength to keep going. I knew I needed to reach my car, needed to get out of there before it was too late. Finally, I reached the camp, breathless and terrified. The flashlight was almost out of battery, and the panic inside me was palpable. I didn't waste any time. I began gathering my things in a rush, throwing everything haphazardly into my backpack. Every second felt like a race against time, as if the forest was about to swallow me whole. I knew I needed to get out of there immediately, but the fear that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike, made me tremble as I worked as quickly as I could. With my backpack packed in a messy hurry and my heart still racing, I started walking toward my car, which was parked a short distance from the camp. The path seemed longer now, every shadow more threatening than before. The flashlight finally died, leaving me with only the moonlight to guide my way. Every snap of a branch, every movement in the leaves, made my heart leap in my chest. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, as if something was following me in the darkness. As I neared the car, the silence around me was almost oppressive. I looked back several times, expecting to see something or someone following me, but all I saw was the darkness that seemed to close in on me. Then, in the midst of that unsettling silence, I heard something that chilled my blood. A distant call, almost a whisper, urging me to come back. The voice was weak but unmistakable, as if it was trying to lure me back to the cliff. "Come back. Don't leave." The voice echoed through the night, filled with a disturbing urgency. I froze in the middle of the path, fear paralyzing me as my heart raced. With trembling hands, I slowly turned to look toward the cliff, trying to understand what was happening. And there at the top, I saw the figure that had disappeared earlier. It was standing at the edge of the cliff, motionless, as if watching me. The moonlight only partially illuminated its silhouette, but I could see that its arms were outstretched, as if it was calling to me. "Please, come back." The voice sounded almost pleading, but there was something deeply wrong with it, something that made my blood run cold. The terror I felt was overwhelming. I knew I needed to get out of there, that whatever that figure was, it was not something I wanted to have any involvement with. Without thinking twice, I spun on my heels and ran as fast as I could toward my car. Each step felt like a desperate effort to escape whatever was pursuing me. The forest around me seemed alive, the shadows moving as if trying to trap me there. Finally, I reached the car, breathless and terrified. Shaking, I got into the car and locked the doors with trembling hands. The figure on the cliff continued to watch me, its oppressive presence still hanging over me. I turned the key in the ignition with so much force that I almost broke it, and the engine roared to life. The scream echoed one more time, now sounding almost desperate, as if it was closer than ever. "Don't leave me here," the voice pleaded, filled with a pain that was almost palpable, but I knew I couldn't stay. Without looking back, I sped away, leaving the camp and the forest behind as quickly as I could. In the days that followed, I tried to forget what had happened, but the memories continued to haunt me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure standing on the cliff or heard the desperate call echoing in the darkness. I knew I could never share the story with anyone without sounding crazy, but what I experienced that night was real, and the fear still lingered with me. I promised myself that I would never return to that forest, but the certainty that whatever was there still existed left me restless. And so, what was supposed to be a simple camping trip turned into a nightmare that will never leave me.